So first at the bat will be Colin Hansen.
Well, thank you, Julia, for that introduction. That may have given you a bit of an overview, a helpful overview that we'll touch on several different levels as we go until 10:30 here. Again, thank you for the invitation to come and talk about this topic. It's a pretty new and interesting one, I think, and one that certainly 5 years ago would have been somewhat unthinkable or quite odd, but we're at a time just recently, you may have seen that in Time magazine recently was doing 10 different trends that were changing the world right now. And the number 3 trend that they identified, author David Van Bema there, was this discussion that we're having here, the new Calvinism. And I've had the privilege of talking with a number of you in this room, which has just been a pleasure for me to be able to get to know you and to help out with different stories. Always good for one journalist to aid another. And there's been a flurry of really interesting articles that you've written that I've read in this last year, especially related to the topic of John Calvin's 500th birthday. Want to give you a little bit of background just on sort of the process that I went through journalistically to be thinking about this topic, how we at Christianity Today, sort of a flagship evangelical magazine founded by Billy Graham a little bit more than 50 years ago, how we stumbled across this story. It was about 2004 or 2005, and just like anything else, the editors met frequently to discuss what are different trends that we need to be covering, where are our blind spots in this magazine, where are we not reaching our audience, essentially. And one of the main discussions that we had was that there's this really hot trend right now. It's called the emerging church. And this was sort of fit a lot of kind of expected narratives that in a post-Christian, this way evangelicals talk about things, in a post-Christian, post-church America, in a lot of ways, at least in certain parts of the country, I should say, less so the South, of course, seems natural that there will be a number of Christians really rethinking the alignment between evangelicals and the religious right, certainly, thinking more about social engagement. Others thinking about questioning some of the basics, actually, of Christian orthodoxy, wondering, is there such a thing as Christian orthodoxy any longer? And are these doctrines really holding us back from being able to, as Christians, reach out and engage the culture? And we did a cover story called The Emergent Mystique. I think this was in 2005, written by Andy Crouch. And it explored these topics. Very popular authors such as Rob Bell, less closely associated, Donald Miller, book Blue Like Jazz, again, sold many millions of copies. And you'll have a panel tomorrow morning on the emerging church. You can hear a little bit more about that trend. But this was a difficult thing for me to really understand. I had just graduated, as Julia said, from Northwestern University in the Medill School of Journalism in 2003, and I had been involved in a number of different Christian groups, including Campus Crusade for Christ there. And I just in that experience, I simply had not met Christian students who were reading a lot of, again, Donald Miller or Rob Bell, or reading more from Tony Jones, again, you hear from tomorrow, and some authors like that. Obviously, they were out there somewhere. I just hadn't come across them in my experience. And it's got me thinking, in my background, the people I knew were reading books like Wayne Grudem, a professor who recently served, until a few years ago, served at the seminary where I currently attend. His book, published by Zondervan, called Systematic Theology, again, very thick tome. This was the sort of thing that I saw fellow students reading. A graduation gift that our ministry gave out to seniors was John Piper's book, Desiring God. The seminaries that they talked about attending, again, still talking about seminary as a positive thing, were places like the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, which has, under Al Mohler's leadership, you have a book from him, Atheism Remix, in there. Under his leadership has become the largest seminary in the country. Essentially, the idea was not that Christians needed to depart from historic Orthodox beliefs, not that they needed to find something new to be able to reach a changing culture, but in fact that what was needed was a return to what they understood, and this is really foundational for understanding this new Reformed movement, what they found to be very biblical beliefs, things as core to the biblical message as God's initiative in saving a people for His own glory. Again, the idea that there's nothing that you can do to merit salvation and to merit that grace, but in fact, only God's grace can save you from yourself, can save you from your sin. These are the centrality in the Christian message of Jesus Christ's death, His atoning death for sin on the cross, and of course His triumphant resurrection 3 days later. These were the sort of things that were discussed among the groups that I knew, and the people who they looked back. Julia talked about some of them, folks like Charles Spurgeon, London preacher from the mid-1800s. A lot of ways, pastor London Metropolitan Tabernacle, described as the first megachurch pastor. So it's people like Charles Spurgeon, or it's people like, I'm sure we can hear from Dr. Piper about Jonathan Edwards. Edwards, for a number of years since his pastoral ministry in the mid-1700s and the First Great Awakening, widely disregarded by many evangelicals who are a little bit embarrassed of his focus on the sovereignty of God, especially in matters of salvation. There was a bit of a revival of academic interest, Jonathan Edwards, based out of Harvard, and late Professor Perry Miller, and then also Yale University, where Edwards attended. That happened in the 1950s, but again, more recently, you see it being popularly taught by John Piper and several others, including Tim Keller, pastor of a Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City. So essentially, this observation I shared with several different of my fellow editors at Christianity Today, and things just started to click. We started to think about how many books had been sold, how many copies, hundreds of thousands of copies that Desiring God had sold. We started to think about, boy, if you think about the different seminaries, it seems like Julia said right there, the number of young people studying to be in the ministry. This is, of course, a bellwether trend. You can see where the church might be going in the future. They're going to places like Southern because they're looking for that sort of hybrid of Baptist belief in the Reformed tradition. And so again, as things started to click, we realized that this was a trend that we couldn't afford to miss. And so that was at which point I traveled across the country, visited Yale. You can read about it, flip through it in the book. Visited Yale University, ran into a group called Reformed University Fellowship, which is tied to the Presbyterian Church. Met with them. It was interesting. They said, we never use this term Reformed. People think we're Jewish if we do. Think Reformed Judaism. So we don't talk about anything like that. So just call it RUF, not Reformed University Fellowship. So I met with students there, visited with Dr. Piper, and came here to Minneapolis and saw the many different expressions in diverse backgrounds. Again, Presbyterians, you expect that from Presbyterians. Baptists, it fits historically, but not recently, as Julie alluded to. Met with even some people who had been involved in the charismatic movement, the Jesus movement, people like C.J. Mahaney out in the Washington, D.C. area, and just planting churches, starting new churches across the country and even in places, Mexico, Wales, and elsewhere. And then also another person you may be familiar with, Mark Driscoll, church of about 8,000 people now in Seattle, someone who kind of really cuts to the chase, I'll put it that way, about these doctrines. I think his description of Calvinism is something like I'm going to butcher it here. It's something like we suck but God loves us still, or something like that. I can't remember, but something just very sort of edgy and just cuts to the chase of these doctrines of total depravity and things like that associated with Calvinism. And again, just we reported that story. Cover said, had a T-shirt, Jonathan Edwards is my homeboy. and sort of capture that mix of young people looking for this today, and yet these are old doctrines. And I guess the last thing I just want to conclude with in these remarks, and we can of course follow up more on it. What I've done for any number of years now is do nothing more than simply ask different sources, pastors, other church leaders, but especially just asking the young people themselves. Again, that's the journalistic enterprise. We can sit here and we can talk about whatever trends we might think are happening, but again, have to cut right to that reporting and say, what are the people on the ground actually saying? And that was one of my favorite parts of writing Young, Restless, Reformed, was just getting to know these people. And essentially, it's a little bit difficult to explain sometimes, but the first thing that I always heard from people is, why do you believe in these beliefs of unconditional election, that there's nothing intrinsically worthy that God found in you to save you, but in fact He saves you despite your sin by His electing grace, and that you can't do any. Ultimately, once He has saved you by His grace, He will persevere you in salvation until the end of days. Why do you believe these things? And the most common response was very simple: because we believe this is what the Bible teaches. We believe that when you read the first opening, the Apostle Paul's epistle to the church in Ephesus, where it talks about God's wonderful predestination of His church before the beginning of time, we believe this is what Paul was talking about. When Jesus says that all that the Father has given into my hand, He will not forsake any of those who have given into His hand. When Jesus says this, as recorded by the Apostle John in his Gospel, this is what we believe is being discussed there. Or, most famously in a lot of cases, Paul's magisterial epistle to the church in Rome, chapter 9. Again, this is what we believe about God's election. So the first thing is simply they just see this is what the Bible teaches. Beyond that, though, just to plant this idea, and maybe we'll follow up on it later, I don't think it's a coincidence that you hear less about this topic in some of the smaller southern hamlets or even Midwestern towns that you might associate with the evangelical movement. Really, if we're talking about the leaders of this new reform movement, we're in places like Minneapolis, St. Paul. We're in Washington, D.C. with Capitol Hill Baptist Church right there near the Capitol building, or out in the suburbs with Covenant Life Church. And we're talking about Seattle with Mars Hill Church. We're talking about Redeemer Presbyterian with Tim Keller in New York City. I don't think it's a coincidence. Put it this way, it's controversial in a lot of these places where you may be writing. It's controversial to say something as basic to Christian belief, historic Christian belief, as Jesus Christ is the only way to know God. That's controversial. It's not as controversial in some southern cities. So if some of these basics of Christian belief are pretty controversial in a place like New York City, believing in predestination, believing in the election of God's grace, believing in the perseverance of that grace, things that have divided Christians for a number of years in churches, those really aren't really a big deal anymore. If your friends or family, maybe you became a Christian later in life, if your friends and family are going to give you grief about just the basics, why would you follow Jesus? Why would you forsake some of these opportunities, forsake some of the wealth? Why would you do these things to follow Jesus? They're not going to be so worried about some of the specifics of the theology. But also in those times, how comforting it is, and I heard this again and again, how comforting it is to know at those times when your faith, for many evangelicals, is, again, a difficult thing, how comforting to know that God loved you before the foundation of the world, and again, that He will persevere you to the end, even through your worst days. These essentially God's sovereignty, a topic that I'm sure we'll hear more from Dr. Piper about. God's sovereignty, a doctrine that many Christians over time have found to be oppressive, or certainly many critics of Christianity have found to be oppressive, actually in the difficult moments of life is of the greatest comfort in the world. And so those are a couple of the just brief introductory reasons for why, and look forward to the questions.